Adesoji Ginla, and welcome again to Adesoji Speaks and this edition of African News Review, episode 1. And this evening, I am joined with a very special guest, a man who I respect his work. He is not just a journalist, a columnist, a social commentator, an author, and one on which I would say his work, one of his most pivotal works, is what this program is based on, which is a book. And I would share, let me a second, his book titled How Manufacturing Hate, How Africa Was Demonized in the Western Media. This is my copy here. I would ask you to try to get your copy. You can hear him laugh, which means good luck with that. But as I understand, you might be lucky enough to get one on Amazon if if the ancestors are indeed with you. Yes. Without further ado, I would let the man even add a bit of words. But prior to him doing so, I should also add that he also has a knack for going around and naming things. And I wonder where he got that idea from. But welcome, Brother Milton.
Okay, Asante Sana. Thank you. Thank you, comrade, for the good work you do in enlightening our people, in making the connections, linking all the dots in our history. As the late Abdurrahman Mohammed Babu wrote in the postscript to Walter Rodney's book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, in order to understand where we are today, we have to know our past. In order to understand where we might be heading, we have to know our present. And you can't know the present without the past. So I'm paraphrasing what he said. So it's very important that we discuss how our history has shaped where we are today in contemporary society. Without any connection to the history, we're just groping around in the dark, looking for solutions in the dark. And that is why we have really been wandering in the forest for the last 60 years, since most African countries won independence. That's why independence has remained independence on paper alone. So sometimes you have to operate outside the box. So, for example, you mentioned my discovery. I believe this would be actually the 4th year anniversary now.
Yeah.
On this coming next week, on April the 23rd, when I was just wandering around in the jungles of Europe, and I came upon this long river. And I asked the European natives, I said, what's going on here? and they claimed it was called the Thames. I have no understanding of what that meant. So I asked one of those European natives to take my photograph posing in front of this river, which then I renamed, of course, River Gulu. And for some reason, it connected very well with many Africans who now started to make that connection. What right did Europeans have to rename our countries, to rename our lakes, our rivers, our mountains, and impose their cultural, intellectual hegemony? Even the Europeans understood, because, the BBC did a short item about it, a short story. And other media outlets also wrote about it. So it's important that we reclaim our past, our history, our culture, tradition by any creative means necessary.
Yeah.
And now with the new media, that we have, we can make those connections. Yeah, I invite sisters and brothers to go out there and make their own explorations of darkest Europe or even darkest North America, and rename these mountains and rivers and lakes. Why not? And let them think about it. It lets them think. In fact, the point was made in the same BBC article about it. They touched upon how Europeans had gone to Africa and done that. And also, thank you for mentioning my book. My book, of course, in similar vein, I went back and I read the European literature. And when I say European, that includes North America as well. How Africa was dehumanized and demonized in the newspapers, in the books by the so-called explorers who renamed these monuments, as I just mentioned earlier, from the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. Of course, those were scouts. They were sent there to gather intelligence, which then benefited formal colonization of Africa in the last 2 decades of the 19th century. So the book, when it was first published in 2020, the book was selling very well. And I know that because I was getting a hefty royalty check on a regular basis. But then I think maybe the publisher was not familiar with the impact that the book might have. Now it seems to me that the publisher is afraid to push and sell my book, which the publisher owns the copyrights too. So it's been very difficult for people to get copies of it. In fact, last year, I was surprised. I was in class and I asked my students, whether they'd read the chapter so we can discuss a couple of the chapters. And one of my students said, "Oh, professor, I could not get a physical copy. That's what I wanted. They only have the digital copy." I said, "Oh, no. When you go to the publisher's website, there are 2 options. One is for digital, one is for hard copy. You should click on the hard copy." I said, "Professor, I really tried." I said, "Oh, no, I'll show you. Bring your computer over to my desk in front of the class." That was when I discovered for the first time that my own publisher had stopped producing the hard copy, even though the contract says both hard copy and digital. So that's why it may be difficult to get a copy of the book, but I'm working with some other publishers. And if I get a deal finalized with another publisher, I will make sure I get the copyright back so that I can get a new publisher. Of course, they want me to pay money to regain my copyright back. But it's something worth doing since they seem to be afraid of the book. So thank you for the introduction, comrade.
I know it's it's a work that has to be celebrated in the sense that it goes to the heart of what, again, like I said, what the essence of this African News Review is about. It's looking at the media, the story that they've written about us, our stories, how are they told, by whom, for whom, and devoid of their biases and prejudices. Because if you take a body of people and you already have a preconceived notion of who they are and what their narrative is, then you're doing both the person you're supposed to be giving said information to a disservice and undermining the humanity of the person you're reporting on.
Right.
So one of your stories in there was of the gentleman who went to Nigeria who was reporting on the Biafra War.
Correct.
And coming back with the grass skirt stories. I mean, if you could just give
absolutely.
a synopsis of
In
that.
fact, his name was Lloyd Garrison, and he was the descendant of the abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison. So his politics and inclinations were much more progressive compared to his peers and contemporaries as a European American. So he was reporting, I think it was posting from the East, actually, his articles.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, another very interesting thing that I didn't mention in the book, when I was going through the archives, I found a letter from his editors in New York saying they would get him out of the country as soon as possible because a Nigerian general had contacted the New York Times and said, we cannot guarantee his safety if we were to catch him in eastern Nigeria. So reluctantly, for him, he was reluctant, but they got him out of the country. But to go to your question, when he was still there and he read one of the articles under his byline published in the New York Times, he was shocked that between him writing it and sending it to New York by cable, in those days, that's what they used, the story had changed. Somehow, the editor sitting in New York inserted a reference to Nigerian tribesmen dressed in skirts made of grass leaf skirts. It's nowadays, they call this fake news, right?
Fake news, yeah.
Absolutely fake, manufactured out of cold, thin air by editors sitting here in New York. And in their mind, a story file from Africa had to be represented in such a way. Obviously, they were not satisfied with what Garrison had written.
Yep.
On the one hand, they preach objective journalism. On the other hand, they undermine an article written by their own correspondent. Think about that. The audacity. This is their own reporter having to now write to his editors and say, wait a minute, how did that end up in my story? I never saw anything like that, It's amazing. And now that, so that's one of many examples. And now obviously people can understand why my own publisher is now afraid to sell my books widely, because the New York Times remains one of the most powerful media companies in the world today in the 21st century.
And yes, okay. So in light of that, I mean, you've taken us back memory lane, and we begin today's episode with the 30-year anniversary of the Rwandan genocide.
Yes.
And why is it necessary to begin from there? Again, this last week, France decided it was time to say, what's the word they use? Let me share my screen. France would say, France decided it is time the Allies could have stopped the Rwandan genocide in 1994. Now, people will probably be wondering, why is this issue now coming to light? Well, unfortunately, there was a book written in the aftermath of the 1994 Rwandan genocide, 1996. 2000 and I think it was 2004. The book came out, and it was written by the Canadian general who led the United Nations mission in Rwanda, Romeo Dallaire. And so Romeo Dallaire was of the opinion that the French could have done a lot more, not least because they impounded machetes that was used in majority of the killings. But somehow those machetes found their way back into where it was supposed not to have gone. And so with France now coming out of a sudden to say, oh, yet we ought to have stopped this, what would you say is their motivation?
Okay, so I have a rather different take on the whole Rwanda tragedy, calamity of 1994.
Okay.
But I will first address the motives behind what France and Macron are saying, which is cynical on many levels. Part of what is not being widely covered right now is the tragedy in Eastern Congo.
Okay.
Which is, of course, the victim of an invasion by Rwanda.
Mm.
Chaos in Eastern Congo benefits Rwanda tremendously in terms of the resources. There was an estimate by Rwanda's Minister of Finance. I think it came out in the Financial Times, like maybe 2 years ago, in terms of resources that are extracted from Eastern Congo and exported by Rwanda. And the value was more than $1 billion US. And that's a significant amount.
Wow.
Absolutely. So, obviously, Rwanda does not have the factories to utilize these resources. These resources end up being shipped to Europe, to North America, and to Asia as well. So by coming up with that statement, it seems to me that France has decided to be a partner with Rwanda in this theft of Congo's resources. Which suggests that Congo is going to have difficulty in really exercising sovereignty over Eastern Congo, which of course is just laden with mineral resources.
Yeah.
So that's my reading of it. And then in terms of stopping the genocide of 1994, I think it would have been very difficult. In fact, France actually tried to get the United Nations Security Council to declare that at that time, before the planes were even shot down, before the genocide occurred, before the presidential plane carrying the late Juvenal Habyarimana, and as well as the president, of course, of Burundi.
Yes,
and Cyprian was shot down. France had tried to get the Security Council to intervene and say that Rwanda had been invaded by Uganda, which of course it had been in 1990 or in October 1. And what is not written about sufficiently was that, in fact, massacres had been occurring from 1990 all the way up to 1994 when the plane was shot down. So had the Security Council actually taken an interest and taken that position, Uganda might have been forced to actually withdraw. And that's not to say that Rwanda would not have remained a tinderbox with many problems. Because, of course, the problem is the land issue, one of the most densely populated countries in the world. Of course, that's number one. Number two, the issue of the descendants of Tutsi who had fled massacres when Rwanda became independent, and they had the initial revolution, which got rid of the monarchy. And many Tutsi were killed at that time. Many fled to Kenya, Uganda, as well as to Tanzania. And they had remained in perpetual exile those many decades, and had always agitated to come back to Rwanda. And then, of course, Many of them in Uganda, the young ones, had helped General Museveni.
Museveni come to power.
Absolutely, to seize power in 1986.
Mm-hmm.
So part of what he had promised to them was that eventually down the line, he would also help them
return the favor. Yeah,
absolutely, to invade and return to Rwanda. So those elements are always left out in the discussion. In fact, the country that owes a major apology to Rwanda and even reparations is the United States. The United States blocked the attempt to get this matter before the Security Council. Number one, it is the United States that provided weapons to Uganda. And later on, some units of the Ugandan armed force turned itself into the Rwanda Patriotic Front. Many people are not aware that Paul Kagame was actually an officer in the Ugandan army. He was a senior intelligence officer. He was sent because he was a Ugandan citizen at that time. He was sent by Uganda to train at Fort Leavenworth in the United States. It was after the invasion occurred, the first commander, I think his name was Fred Rugema, was killed under very mysterious circumstances, by the way, within the first 2 days of the invasion.
2 days of the first fight.
And then Kagame left his training at Fort Leavenworth, United States, went straight back to Uganda, and went to take command of the Rwanda Patriotic Front. So United States' role has not been effectively dealt with. It is much more destructive than the role of France, Belgium, or any other party. And that's the role that still needs to be fully explored, and its liability. In fact, one other point I would like to add. It is the United States that blocked a thorough investigation of the shooting down of the presidential plane.
The planes,
which is discussed in a very interesting BBC documentary called Rwanda's Untold Story. So if anybody wants to watch it, go on Google and then put Rwanda's Untold Story, and it will take you to a link to Venmo, where you can watch the documentary, which of course the BBC is not promoting that documentary widely anymore because Rwanda declared the BBC a genocide denier after that documentary came out. But the documentary includes statements by who became Rwanda's ambassador to the United States, Rudasinghe, and it includes statement by General Nyamwasa, Kayumba Nyamwasa, who was Rwanda's chief of military staff. And both of them say, in fact, it was Kagame who ordered the plane to be shot down. Now, what would be the motive? The motive was that the peace treaty signed in Tanzania would have led to one man, one vote. And obviously, given the composition of the population, with Hutu being overwhelming majority, it would have been as if the rebellion had never happened, the invasion, because they would end up having a Hutu-dominated government. So the only way it could really come to power was by military means. And of course, by creating that conflagration, that tragedy, then he could then come and say, I'm the one who rescued the country. And that is actually what unfolded.
Wow, interesting. And to think we had the reports that had less than 1,000 words, and you've just given us a walk down the history lane as to, I mean, you won't get this in Western media anyway. So
no, you won't, and that's part of the tragedy of Western media. They're weapons of mass distraction, weapons of mass disinformation. And part of it, of course, is to maintain this global narrative that, of course, allows the contradiction that the most wealthy continent in the world can at the same time have the most impoverished people in the world, by constantly referring to poor African countries, poor African. There's not a single poor African country. They
True.
are impoverished
Published. Yeah.
African
Intentionally.
countries.
Yeah.
Impoverished comes by action. You see, action that is being taken detrimental to Africa's development and growth. And that is why they remain impoverished, but they are not poor. You find Nkrumah used the best description in his book, which is always nearby because it's one of my favorite books.
Neocolonialism, the last stage of imperialism. Yes.
Absolutely. In the introduction, what does Nkrumah say? Nkrumah calls it, you find this term very quickly right here. It's the best description. I propose to analyze neocolonialism first by examining the state of the African continent and showing how neocolonialism at the moment keeps it artificially poor. Artificially poor. That's what Nkrumah said. And it's 100% correct. It is artificially poor. It is not poor in reality. How can a country like Congo, with all those resources that the developed industrialized world needs, how can Congo at the same time be one of the most impoverished countries? It doesn't make sense. It is because Congo's resources are exploited, the labor of Congolese are exploited, and you can duplicate that across every African country. And that explains our current situation, you know?
Thank you very much. And yes, and so which gives us a very important segue since we're still marking anniversary. Another anniversary would be the Chibok girls, who again 10-year anniversary of the Chibok girls being kidnapped from their school. 276 Nigerian girls snatched from their school. Some would escape, but from a school in Chibok in northeast Nigeria, Borno State. And for years, they've been looked for, sought after, and the understanding is they were being held in Sambisa Forest. Now, Sambisa Forest is in a place bordering Nigeria and Chad. Again, one cannot help but imagine what the possible motivation can be for their kidnap. Because when it happened in 2014, people were of the opinion that why kidnap girls, and especially vulnerable girls, take them into bush, devoid their families of contact and what have you. And the state has, to an extent, would say it has done what it can. But here's the thing. If you cannot protect your citizens, how is it you can call yourself a sovereign state?
Absolutely.
So my initial take was, when it happened, was, okay, we're looking at a country bordered in the northeast by Cameroon, Lake Chad, Republic of Chad, and Niger Republic. Now, what do all of them have in common? They all speak French. Now, why is that a key thing? Because initially it was like, this story does not add up. When you say you're Boko Haram, you're an Islamic insurgency, but you're attacking people who do the same thing as you, it just doesn't make sense. Now, some would say, but they're doing it to each other. The first major Islamic group that really took hold in Nigeria then was in the 1980s, and it was called the Matisine sect. The government crushed it, but then most of the people were not in favor of whatever it is they prefer as their dictum. But this one has taken on a turn, which is hard to comprehend. And so, again, if you look through the news reports, you can't really piece anything together until you lay a series of events that have happened in around 2014. One was the fact that for the first time, power went from the north to the south in Nigeria. And some people saw it as a way of undermining the government. But even though that government has been out of power for now more than 12 years, the problem still persists. And now the kidnapping is not so much as ideological, it's financial. So you begin to see loads and loads of threads of economic issues, political issues, and obviously it takes a religious connotation because of who is seizing said girls.
Correct.
So what do you think?
Well, you've touched upon many of the possible motives and reasons behind it, and of course, a key amongst those is the weakness of the state itself, the Nigerian federal state, the nation itself, which of course is something that has been consistent pretty much since the country won its independence. The elite political class has really failed Nigeria tremendously. And of course, the failure continues. And it's not unique to Nigeria. So it's not like I'm laying any particular criticism or critique of Nigeria. I'm critiquing the African state, actually.
It's a legacy of
The African
colonialism.
state remains mostly a fictitious state, right? Where you have a power really centralized amongst the elite with no concrete connection to the grassroots, right? So in a situation like that, it's not surprising that now you find when you need the National Army to intervene, the National Army actually has no capacity to be effective in really dealing with this phenomenon that's now bedeviled Nigeria for decades. Just imagine a major nation like Nigeria with all its resources, if this had been made a national priority, who really believes that this issue would not have been resolved a long time ago? If Nigeria had said, this is our number one priority, we will deploy the necessary military resources, the diplomatic resources, and the financial resources, of course, because it has to be a multi-pronged approach. You cannot say, we're just going to have a military approach. We have, firepower, and we will deal with that and crush this situation. Because, quite frankly, as you actually also alluded to, a lot of this also has issues connected with, marginalization of that part of the country in terms of, education, in terms of economic development, in terms of deprivation. So young people have incentive to be recruited into the kind of activities that Boko Haram would engage in. If they were really involved in alternative activities, I imagine the young people don't like to go out there and be hiding in the forest or in the jungles also, putting their lives at jeopardy. If they had other activities that, could allow them to flourish, actually. So these are all tied in together. And obviously, we've read many accounts of how even elements of the army sometimes collaborate with them in terms of selling them weapons, So that goes back to the elements that would want to undermine whoever is the president at that particular time. So it has to be a multi-pronged issue. It has to be sold to the nation as something that, if we resolve this collectively as Nigeria, it would benefit everybody in the country. But I don't think that approach has been taken. I don't think the crisis is seen that way, personally.
True. And also, aside from that, it's also the fact that there's a lack of morale in the armed forces. Years and years of underfunding, lack of training, lack of materials. Again, yes, you want to do so much, but then if you don't have the capacity to approach the task at hand, you're defeated even before you've started. And
Yes,
so
I agree.
The loss in the course of executing the challenge itself, most of it had come from lack of equipment. I mean, there was a time when deserting became the only way they can register their dissent, but eventually it sort of died down. Now at the moment, it's much more internal displacement. So the kidnapping is internal. So again, going back to what you were saying, it's the society, lashing out at the lack of resources to carry out normal economic activities. And left to their own devices, if it's easy money, even at the cost of rupturing society.
Absolutely.
They're carrying out kidnappings.
And it's really tragic. It's sad, but it speaks to many of the underlying currents that are evolving in many African countries, with a tremendously burgeoning youth population, right? When we're dealing with separate crisis points, but we are not making the connection that what connects all of them is that Africa has the world's youngest population. The employment opportunities are not expanding. So a lot of the disruptions that we see are actually very predictable. And the population, of course, continues to increase. The youth population continues to increase. The economic retraction is occurring in many African countries. So if we think that we are in a crisis position today, as we speak in 2024, where will the continent be in the next 5 to 10 years? It's actually quite frightening.
With the projections.
And in my own estimation, if we don't take radical transformative measures that are quite different from what we are engaged in right now, that the continent could become overwhelmed. And I'm not trying to create like a doomsday scenario, but if you look at the objective facts, the youth population continues to increase rapidly. Population in general on the African continent, fastest growing in the world. While employment opportunities diminish, there's no industrialization, right? Just producing so-called raw materials, minerals, and agricultural products.
Industries, yes.
And we have to depend on the well wishes of the outside world. If they don't have demand for the products at one particular time, then it means income collapses. If there's a surge because they're producing more and they need raw materials, then income goes up. We cannot develop nations based on that type of erratic economic activity. So that's what I really mean, that we're in a position where we have to become much more insistent, much more demanding of the leadership. And if the leadership are not presenting ideas how to address these issues, we must
Vote
not
them out.
tolerate their existence, because it means we as Africans are subsidizing our own suicide. That's unacceptable.
So speaking of insisting things had to change, which brings us to the election of Bassirou Faye,
Yes,
the president of the new president of Senegal.
correct.
And let's just say things have been very interesting. Right from his oath of office on Tuesday, and he immediately announced the appointment of Usman Sonko as his prime
Correct.
minister,
Mm-hmm.
which goes to show that it's no longer business as usual.
Correct.
At 44, he is Africa's youngest elected president. He took his office promising systemic change